presentation. Okay, so who here has heard of the Data Breach Investigations Report? Oh, that's awesome. That's people. I'm Gabriel Bassett. I'm the lead data scientist for the 2019 DBIR. I do like the tooling behind the report, the figures, the fact-checking, non-incident analysis. I also write a few sections. And I'm not the only author. These are the 4 people, so if I'll put myself up here beside it, these are the 5 people that wrote the report this year. If anyone at Verizon tells you otherwise, they're lying. And it happens. Now, I'm going to come up and I'm going to talk about a bunch of lists of things that I think are interesting and stuff, but most of the things that are going to be on slide are going to be charts and figures and stuff like that. So I put all of the interesting lists of things to do and stuff like that in a separate PDF that's on AWS. You can go download it. This way, you don't have to worry about trying to type it out as I say it, because it's certainly never going to show up on screen. I'll have this also at the very end as well, so when I click away from it here in like 5 seconds, don't feel like you've lost it forever. So what is the DBIR? When we started the report back a dozen years ago, information security was very anecdotal, right? You heard the story about some breach, and it's like, oh, that's what we got to do. We have to protect against that. And then the next story came up and was completely different, and that's what people protect against. And the problem was, it wasn't really telling the story of what the average organization should expect to see. And so they started going through our incident response reports and analyzing them as a data set. And over time, we've added countries, contributors, breaches, incidents, and even non-incident data like malware, blocks, phishing tests, honeypot data, stuff like that. And the whole goal here is to decrease the bias in the data set as well as improve the context around what we report, so that when we report on this is what we think happens to the normal company, that is something that people can make decisions based on. And so before we get too far in, I want to clear up 2 major misconceptions that come up every single year. The first is the attackers are almost always external. Because, right, we always hear things like, yeah, people talk about the external attacker, but you really have to worry about the insider. You need to worry about the outside guy. Like, he's the one who's your big problem. Because even most of the internal stuff are errors, people just making mistakes. They're not malicious. And the other one is that most of the attacks are espionage. In fact, almost all attacks, well, a substantial increase as attacks are financial. Espionage, even this uptick here is due to mainly public administration, so government. Almost all the attackers are financially motivated. Even some of the espionage is financial. And so getting those 2 big misconceptions out of the way, let's get into the meat of it. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this entire report, of everything I'm going to come up here and say, it's that the attackers are not just looking for the easy win, they're looking for the easiest win. And what that means is that you as an organization don't have to be perfect. You don't even actually have to be good. You just have to be a little better than worst. And so this is what I mean by that. The 4 things you have to worry about are the 4 horsemen. It's patching, errors, social attacks, and credentials. Those 4 things are like 85% of all breaches. So let's go into those individually. Starting with patching. And when I say patching, I don't mean like it's cool if you've got the patch process, it gets things patched every month or every week. You got everything patched. When I say patching, I mean like try to patch, telnet facing the internet. Like, I mean the obvious stuff. And I mean the obvious stuff facing the internet that's 10 years old. Because that's the kind of stuff you get hit with patching. And so what we have up here is this is data from honeypot data versus like internet scan data. And it's the ratio of the ranks. And so, for example, telnet, look for. On the other hand, it's only the 15th most common port on the internet. And the ratio of like 1 to 15 is 15. And these are the highest ratios. And if you look, these are all things that we have known vulnerabilities for, right? But they're not like new known vulnerabilities. They're like vulnerabilities that are as old as our middle schoolers. These are old things. And so try to get those off the internet, which is easier said than done. Because the reality is, we probably, if you're in this room listening to this, you probably know to patch things or, turn on the firewall, things like that. On the other hand, what tends to bite us is asset discovery. A lot of times we don't simply know what assets other parts of our organizations are putting online. And so a big part to effective patching is, one, having good asset discovery and asset management, and two, going out and actually looking for what might have happened or might have gotten put on the internet while you weren't watching as a security organization. The second thing to talk about are errors. And so if you read the report, you might have noticed sysadmins are starting to trend up. And that's not because your sysadmins are evil. Well, it's not because most sysadmins are evil. I can't really talk about your sysadmins. Most of them are not evil. Most of them are making mistakes. In fact, what we're seeing here is a change in how we report security, right? Because now when someone has a breach of a cloud-based service, they find like an open storage bucket on the internet. Like the researcher that finds that doesn't go and necessarily just tell the organization and help them close it. They also go to the news outlet and go, hey, we found 1 billion credentials, stored in a storage bucket online. And because it gets public reported, it gets put into data sets like ours, and that causes error to trend up. But we've really known this has been a problem for years and years and years, because the industries that have mandatory reporting, like healthcare and public administration, both have had really high rates of error compared to all the other industries. What that means is that error goes underreported. So, what can you do about it? First, who here, if I want you to do anything, I want you to treat errors the same way you treat patching and vulnerabilities, because errors represent 21% of breaches this year. Exploiting vulnerabilities represent at most 6% of breaches this year. Let that sink in, because I suspect that most of you are spending a whole bunch of money on patching and dealing with vulnerabilities and hunting down those little things. But that's not what the attackers want, because they want the easiest thing, right? And exploiting vulnerabilities isn't always easy. On the other hand, errors just happen. It doesn't take some long, complex attack path. And so who here is spending 20% of their security budget on fixing and mitigating errors? Who here is spending any of their security budget on fixing and mitigating errors? Good, we got like 3 additional hands for that one, right? We should be spending, almost as much money on fixing errors as we are dealing with credentials or dealing with patching, and it's far more than we should be spending on vulnerabilities, because we're actually doing a good job of handling vulnerabilities. And how do you spend that money? You want to prepare to degrade gracefully. I'm going to drive back to Nashville, Tennessee right after this talk. And on the drive back, if my car springs a leak, and if the tire springs a leak, I don't expect the car to explode. But, that happens in security. You have one error and it turns into a huge problem. It turns into a breach. And so looking around your organization, find the data that, if it were exposed, would turn into a breach, and look at the processes, procedures, systems that touch that data. Because the reality is, no person, no process, no system, no tool is perfect. And we always act like they are. We build our systems on the assumption that people are going to be perfect. And then we're like, my gosh, he clicked something. That's silly. We build them on the assumption that our tool is going to be perfect. It's going to stop everything. It didn't stop everything. We have to plan for failure of our systems. And this isn't as hard as it sounds, right? Because process improvement systems have been looking at this for years. And so you can go and look at process improvement frameworks, at how they improve their processes and apply those back to your security processes. Now, the third part is social engineering, or social attacks. And these kind of come in 2 different parts: financially motivated social engineering and phishing. We'll talk about financially motivated social engineering first. And we used to, when we came into the report, we probably would have called it business email compromise, but we started to look, and a lot of these don't actually even require an email to be compromised. In fact, there was one last week that was not really one we put in the report because it was compromising individuals, but it was like some person created an email account that sounded like roughly the same as a pastor at a church, and then emailed everyone there saying, hey, I'm collecting money to do whatever, and people started sending the person money, right? They didn't compromise anything. In fact, this is my favorite quote from the entire report. You have to hand it to the attackers. At some point, one must have just thought, why don't we skip all the hard hacking and, just ask for the money? And it works. It works all the time. And so you need to be prepared for it. And the reason, of course, that they're targeting executives is because that's where the money is. Like, if I want to go and spend $1,000, I have to go through 4 levels of approval. On the other hand, if an executive says, hey, transfer a bit of money, that's going to happen. In fact, I'm the CFO for another nonprofit. And I'm like, haha, this is funny. Oh, shoot, that's me. Because... right? If I get an email from our CEO that says, hey, we're ordering stickers for this conference, can you send $100 to the dude who ordered them and put it together? I'm like, sure, that sounds like a great idea. And I'm like, I'm going to end up in my own data set. And that's not good, And so I can see how these things happen, but you need to be prepared to have a process to verify money transfers outside of email for anything below what you're willing to lose. Because we're going to talk about it later, but the median email compromise cost, according to the FBI, was $24,000. According to the FBI's data set, this is the IC3 data, but they present it differently when they talk about it. And so $24,000 isn't a lot in the scheme of a large business. And so you need to be prepared to have a process around at that level of spending unless you're willing to lose that amount of money. Now, the other half of this is social attacks. And so now the good news is we're getting better at phishing, right? It was 25% of phishing test emails were working in 2012, and now we're down to 3%. But on the other hand, we're still hovering around 20% or above of breaches involving phishing. And so the question is, why is that? And a good example is like my wife over Memorial Day. We're out at my brother-in-law's lake house. He's got this really nice lake house, a beautiful dock. And so we're down there, and my wife's fishing along the shore. And now, granted, she could have walked 20 feet out to the other end of the dock and fished straight out into really out into the lake, right? Because the reality is most of the big fish are probably down in the lake somewhere. They're probably swimming in the middle a little bit deeper. In fact, 97% of the fish might be down there in the middle of the lake. But if there's 3% that are along the bank, and that's enough to keep her happy fishing all day, there's no reason for her to even walk to the other end of the dock. Right? And the same thing applies to the attackers. If that 3% is enough to keep them busy day to day stealing money from us, they're going to do it. And so what can we do about it? And this is based off of the data that we've looked at, right? There's 3 things you need to block by email. You need to block links, you need to block executable attachments, and you need to block macro-enabled Office documents. Because one, we're not really getting a lot of links, and more than likely those links are going to look like a login to something. They're going to steal credentials. And maybe you have a tool that simply filters that. No one's getting their executables by email. When was the last time someone mailed you an executable and it was a legitimate thing? Right? That doesn't happen, does it? And the other thing is there's maybe 3 or 4 people in your organization that need macro-enabled Office documents, and you can set up that separate process for them, but no one else should be allowed to touch those. The other things you can do to stop phishing is give people an easy way to report. Because most of your phishing reports are going to come in the first hour, but only a third of the clicks happen in the first hour, because those are the people that were sitting at their desk and are really keeping up on email. Then there's the rest of the people. The next third comes in over the next day, and the next third comes in over the next week. And so potentially, if you're giving people the ability to report and you're acting on their reports, you could stop 2/3 of the phishing clicks before they ever happen. And so give people a way to report. And then finally, there's people in your organization who have to open attachments. It's really easy for us in the IT portions of the organization to go, I never open attachments from people I don't know. Because let's be honest, who emails the sysadmins hey, yeah, here's a PDF, please. Other than vendors, who emails a security person and goes, hey, here's a PDF, please open it. On the other hand, your legal department, if they get someone sending them a PDF, they've got to open that, right? Because there's a chance that could be an existential threat to the business. The PR department has to open those types of documents. And so give those people a leg up. Give them a sandboxed operating system, because while we really probably do need a full laptop to do our work, they're probably going to be happy with something like a tablet or a sandboxed operating system that won't run the malware. And so set them up for success. And then the final one is credentials. And just to reiterate, they were patching, errors, social attacks, and now credentials. And credentials made up 29% of breaches this year. Who here is familiar with credential stuffing? Good. That's what I want to see. Right? So we know what it is. And the reality is this is like the number one way attackers get in. Because they're not really targeted. They really don't care who they get into. And if you don't care who you get into, you can just buy all the credentials you need, and then you go and target the types of organizations you want. And credentials get used all the time. And a lot of it actually gets used on mail systems. In fact, we had this big bump in like credentials being used to log into mail systems in cloud infrastructure. And the reason wasn't because of anything related to cloud. It was because that's where our workflows are going, is to using cloud services for email and things like that. So cloud isn't less secure. It's just where we're doing our work nowadays. And so what do you do about this? As we got ready for the DBIR, as we were doing kind of the podcast and stuff, where I got the chance to talk to Rafal Los on his, and I can't remember if it was on the podcast or before it. He said something like, the DBIR is kind of like an ad for two-factor authentication. And I'm like, yeah, it really is. Because we have so much credential misuse. And two-factor authentication just adds that nice extra bump. And we'll explain why adding another step in the attacker's attack path is important as we get into the path section. But it's incredibly important. And of course, make sure to turn off IMAP and POP3 because the two-factor authentication doesn't necessarily get applied to those things. And also, when we talk about two-factor authentication, right, it's really easy, and I almost always skip over this part, but we say oh yeah, it's really easy to turn on two-factor authentication. But the reality is, for our system admins, and whether it's a large or small organization, this is not necessarily an easy task. If you're a small organization, maybe there's not a lot of work that goes into it, but you're having to do 1,000 jobs as a system admin. And so now you have to manage a bunch of users who aren't really sure how to use two-factor authentication, and you're having to deal with all that. If you're a big organization, yes, maybe you have dedicated resources and processes to deal with, and you can pay for professional support, but now you're trying to integrate it with that really funky single sign-on system that people deployed and bounces through a dozen different links, or you're trying to integrate it with the VPN concatenator that's been around since, God knows when, and no one has any clue how it works. It still works, and no one wants to touch it because of that. And so you're trying to make these things work. And so it is very important to appreciate the effort that goes into any of these mitigations. And this is also why it's important to focus our mitigations on the things that actually matter, these 4 horsemen. And so when it comes to passwords, also do the obvious stuff. Get password managers for your employees to help prevent reuse. Look at the services that consolidate password breaches to see if your credentials have been breached. And finally, have sane password policies. It doesn't make sense. I'm going to complain here, and I enjoy getting to complain about it because it fits in really well. I have an iPhone, and I just got this iPhone. It's the first time I have an iPhone for my work phone. And I had to put in a PIN number. And I put in this really nice random PIN. And then 3 months later, they said, change your PIN. I'm not changing my PIN every quarter. My PIN is now 2019-01, and it's going to follow that as long as I have this phone. Because I am not changing my PIN that often. And the same thing applies to our users. If we give them bad policies, they are going to work around it. And so, by the way, so those first 4 we're talking about the 85% of breaches. Let's talk about the other 15% really quick. In the 15%, there's kind of this standard process. And we'll talk about advanced breaches a couple other times during the report, but what I want you to take away is these follow a very different path. They're very external, they're very espionage focused, and they follow a path of kind of a social attack leads to dropping malware, which leads to kind of internal hacking and pivoting, and stealing internal data and secrets. Now, an interesting thing to take away from that, right, is the social part. The attacks still start with phishing, even the advanced ones. And so whether or not you're dealing or trying to stop the 85% of the 100%, make sure you have a way of dealing with phishing, because the attackers, advanced attackers, are much more targeted. And if they're targeted, they can't just buy a set of credentials and hope it goes to the target they want. They actually have to target the target. And they're just as lazy as anyone else. And so what are they going to do? They're going to use phishing because it works. And the problem is we also kind of always spend our time thinking about what happens on target in breaches. And we really want to think in terms of paths, because when it comes to breaches, it's not really a snap in time, right? It takes a couple of steps. And so if you saw this in the report, you were probably baffled, because it's kind of artsy. but you can't really read it like you read a book. And so having this up here where I can actually point at, I don't have to even use the pointer, I can walk up. So the way you read this is these are the steps that it takes to get to the end of the attack. And most of the attacks are pretty short. But there's this one big one out here, right? This is 14 steps, and that's like an action compromising something, an action compromising something for each step. Now the vertical area, like the starting point, is going to be the action, which is also the color. And so you see that, and by the way, these would look much better if the colors on the bulbs were set up, because these are, I think, actually green. But let's just pretend that all these ones on the bottom are green. We'll use our imagination. And so all the hacking ones kind of start at the same spot vertically, and then up here, the top are kind of the social ones. And they bounce back and forth. And so this is a hacking action compromising confidentiality, and then another hacking action compromising integrity, and then this is malware, and it kind of goes back and forth. And I really don't expect anyone to read every individual path. I want you to get kind of a bigger concept out of this. And of course, the first one is that most of the attacks are short. So let's look at those 15% we were talking about, the long paths. And this coloring in here is grayed out. So we're really looking at these colored ones here. And one of the things you notice is that for advanced attacks, they almost all kind of bounce back and forth between kind of hacking and malware. A lot of them start with phishing up here. And this leads into one of the things I want you to take away. I'm going to have you take away 3 defensive opportunities you can get from thinking in terms of paths. And the first one is you get to pick where you want to meet the attacker. Right? If it's just a snap in time, right, there's no point in there that you can choose. But if you think in terms of a path, you can say, maybe I want to stop the attacker at the beginning of the path. Or maybe I want to stop him in here when he's kind of bouncing around inside my organization. If you think in terms of paths, you can start to think in terms of what you want to stop. On the other hand, this is where those short paths become very important, because short paths, you don't have as many steps. And when you look at the short paths, you see some patterns. You see the errors. You see the social attacks. You see the credential use. In fact, you also see a couple other things that are almost never seen in big attacks. Big attacks or long attacks are almost never errors. They rarely involve misuse. They rarely are physical. Those attacks happen very quickly, always. Now, this gets into the second thing you can do to defend using paths. And that is that you want to make the path longer for the attacker, because the attackers want short paths, right? The vast majority of attacks are short paths. Only a few are out here in a lot of steps. And so every time you think about that really fancy attack where they came in and then they used the vulnerability and then they pivoted to domain admin and then they searched for that thing, that happens that amount. And the reason is because those kinds of attacks don't succeed a lot. Right? This is that story that the attackers, we've always heard, right, that defenders have to be perfect every time, attackers only have to get right once. Who's here heard that? Right? Yeah, we all heard that. How many people have heard the corollary, which is that attackers have to get every step in their attack right, defenders only have to stop one of them? Have you heard that? Much fewer. But that's the whole point. And if I can add a step in here, if I can add two-factor authentication, right, that lengthens the path, and it filters out some of the people in the attack, a substantial amount. Because it's not about being perfect, it's about filtering some of the attackers out at every step. Now, the final thing, that final defensive opportunity you can take from path data is here. These are the actions that happened at the beginning of the attack, and the ones that happen in the middle, and the ones that happen at the end. And what's interesting is not at the top, it's at the bottom. And so the least likely action to start a breach is malware. And no, this doesn't surprise anyone. No one goes oh, I just never realized that malware has to come from somewhere. But it's not something we think about a lot. On the other hand, malware is very often in the middle of attack, which obviously these have to be 3 steps. You don't have a middle if you don't have 3 steps. But malware is in the middle. And on the other side, social almost never ends an attack. And as a defender, what that means is that you can consider what you haven't seen based on what you have. So that's the next defensive opportunity, guessing what you haven't seen based on what you do see. Because if you are seeing a social attack, social, you can probably guess that you're going to see something else before the end of the attack. On the other hand, if you're seeing malware, that probably means you need to look back in time at what happened before. And the more you look at your data, hopefully you will realize the more about what you see leads to what happened before and after the attack. And then finally, before I get into the industries, I want to talk about something that we've talked about paths, but we really haven't talked about what happens before the path and after the path. Because in security, we always focus on the targets, or on the actions on target. We don't talk about what happens before and after them. Excuse me. And so to think about that, oh, this would look so much better if there was color. Just pretend there are lots of lines here. Like, does anyone remember this chart from the report? You know, okay. So you can look at the report later and replace this in your mental image with the actual figure. We looked at data from like criminal forums and criminal marketplaces, you know, the quintessential dark web. And like, I was expecting to get there and to see like, you know, the Amazon of evil. Like, you know, you're like, I want ransomware, and it pops up a bunch of options and good ratings and such. And it was not that. It's like listening, like, it was depressing, honestly, because I was looking for something cool, and what I got was the equivalent of 15-year-olds chatting over like some video game live chat. It is like that level of quality. And so, you know, I'm looking for a lot of malicious stuff, right? I'm looking for the attackers kind of trading stuff and preparing their attacks and using the services that they need to set up something up. And what I got was lots of drugs. That is what they're being used for, is lots and lots of trading drugs. And I ended up having to filter out, you know, this huge list. It took hours to get all the drug references out. And then what we got to was just a little bit of this. It's like the vast majority of content on these criminal forums was around trading bank information, either credit card information or payment accounts and bank accounts. There were only two things that stood out. The first was a little cluster over here around accounts. So VPN accounts or proxy accounts, but also like online video type accounts. So services that you pay for video, movies and such, both the family-friendly kind and the adult kind. There was lots of that going on. And then the final thing that we saw a little bit was purchase and sale of new phones. And the reason is because new phones are a great way to launder money if you're attacking. So the attackers will maybe use personal information to buy they want to cash out personal information that they've stolen. So they buy phones on someone else's credit, but now those phones are kind of sketchy, and so they can go and they can sell them here, and that helps them launder the money. On the other side, there's people with dirty money who, you know, maybe want to launder that and get phones. And so it turns out that there's a robust trade in phones on these sites as well. Now, the other thing we looked at that happens before and after a breach is data from the FBI. And this was really good because, you know, we try to talk, when the FBI presents this, they talk about, you know, something like $5 billion lost to business email compromise over the last couple of years. But we're trying to report on what happens to the normal company. And what happens to the normal company is that not a lot is lost, right? The normal amount is, I think, $8,000 for a computer data breach and $24,000. This is what the attacker takes. And so what that means is that the majority of your cost when you have a breach is not going to come from what the attacker stole, more than likely. It's going to come from incident response, and it's going to come from outside legal counsel. And that's from the 2016 report. And so if you're an organization, plan for those costs, because those are the ones that are going to bite you. And additionally, if you do have a business email compromise, when the IC3 recovery asset team acts upon a business email compromise and works with the destination bank, half of all US-based business email compromise victims have 99% or more of their money recovered or frozen, and only 9% had nothing recovered. You know, what that means is that it's not over even if a business email compromise happens, right? Don't just like throw in the towel. In fact, this happened just like last week. There was like a phishing email led to a business email compromise. The organization lost like, I think 2.1 million or something. And the news article said they expect to get it all back. And the reason is because if you work with law enforcement will go to the bank and go, hey, could you just maybe hold on to that money a little bit longer before you send it anywhere else? And because we want to really figure out maybe where it came from. And they freeze the money, and then eventually it gets transferred back to you. If the money that gets stolen from you goes to a bank, you still have the ability to act. And so now let's talk about industries. And I'm going to pretty much breeze through the industries because there's a couple of sides for each, but the reality is no one cares about any industry but their own. And so there's going to be like one side that you care about and then 20 sides that you couldn't care less about. But we'll try to hit kind of the high points for several of the industries. I'm also going to show you the paths for each of the industry just to kind of get a visible view of what happens. Here, in accommodation and food services, they have a lot of hacking and malware, right? These look like the advanced attacks, and they are. I'm also going to show you the most common paths. Here, the most common path was hacking leading to confidentiality, and leading to malware breaching confidentiality. And the reason is because accommodation and food services has a huge problem with point-of-sale breaches. In fact, they're almost all discovered by fraud detection, which is common point of presence, which is where the credit card company calls you and says, hey, everyone that purchased anything from your organization on Thursday has had fraudulent transactions. We think you may have a breach, which is not how you want to find out about your breaches. This happens a lot in accommodation and food services, and what it means is that those types of organizations need to go and protect their point-of-sale systems, and they also need to get better at detecting these types of attacks. Next, moving on to education. This one, you can tell, compared to the other one, is a little more diverse. There's more going on. But here, the most common path are errors leading to a breach of confidentiality, and this is going to be something you're going to see a lot in this. Now, education is a bit different. It's a little bit interesting. They've had a little bit of a drop in espionage. There used to be a lot of espionage here. Now it's more financially driven. But they still have a lot of error. Slightly more than 1/3 of the breaches were due to human error, right? And this is going to be something we're going to come back to because we talked about error causes a lot of breaches, but we don't really appreciate that. Also, one of the things that was surprising here is if you read the report like last year, we saw a lot of, and especially in 2017, we saw a lot of W-2 fraud, where the attackers would steal W-2 forms and they file fraudulent tax returns. And that's dried up. It happened it was 20% of breaches in education, and we saw none of that this year across anything. But we don't know why. Moving on. Finance is a really interesting one. Again, you can see it kind of bounces around, but again, error leading to breaches of confidentiality are the most common attack path. Now, one of the unique things is we get a lot of data, and this we don't include in the main corpus because it would bias the whole thing. You just, if you had 40,000 breaches, right, that's all you'd see in every stat. But this is all botnet data. This is breaches where a bot takes over an account and then compromises the financial institution through its customers. And it applies to other things. Information technology companies have some similar problems, but the vast majority of it is financial institutions. And this is compared to payment card system breaches in financial, which are kind of going down. So this is going down. This is really big. And what that means is if you're a financial institution, you need to worry less about payment card breaches, so skimmers on ATMs and such, and a lot more about credentials. The attackers are no longer really going after the credit cards. They're going after the credentials that let them into your customers' accounts. And so if you're a financial institution, you need to do a lot to protect your customers because that's what the attackers are coming after. Moving on to healthcare, and healthcare has a really diverse set of breaches because they kind of operate like a little city. They have utilities, they have financial organizations, they have healthcare, they have IoT devices, they have all the different parts, they have retail. Still, error leading to confidentiality was the biggest path. In fact, they have to report, they have mandatory reporting for these kinds of things, so it was very large. Now, if you're in healthcare, the big thing that is interesting in healthcare is that they're the one industry that has more internal breaches than external. And that's due to two things. The first is errors. We talked about how errors are very big, particularly in healthcare, but they also have a lot of misuse because you have a lot of people who have access to this sensitive internal data, and some of them are using it for malicious purposes. They're stealing healthcare records to go file fraudulent health returns. Some of them are stealing because they're just curious. There was a breach we recorded where it was like one of these major, accidents that injured several people. And then like several months later, they indicted several of the healthcare workers and fired them because it turned out a bunch of healthcare workers were going in and accessing the medical records of the people that were involved in the accident, right? With no legitimate use. And so internal actors are very important in healthcare, and it's both due to error and misuse. On the other hand, moving on to information, this again is error leading to confidentiality because information companies, by the way, information companies are like all your technology companies that you would think out. Like if you got the drop down and you have industries and it says technology, that's where most of the information companies think of. So all the big internet companies and such. But again, these internet information companies are using cloud services and such, and so they have a lot of errors due to that. Misconfigured storage that exposes credentials and such in databases or file stores. Now here, internal actors were still pretty big, and this again is due to error. Error from misconfiguration. So if you're in information, the first thing is to look at where your errors are coming from and how those are leading to breaches. The next one, though, is 29% of breaches in information were due to cyber espionage. And 22% stole secrets. And so while the information industry has a substantial error issue, they also have a lot of corporate espionage stealing internal secrets as well. Moving to manufacturing, which I always like manufacturing because you're like, why would manufacturing have a breach? Like what, they're not stealing like steel. But there is a little bit here, and they actually have misuse leading to confidentiality is the main point. And it used to be that the big thing in manufacturing was espionage, so corporate espionage, stealing secrets. But now it's a little bit different. It's more financially motivated, but the path is still the same. It's still phishing, leading to malware, leading to the loss of internal data and secrets. Still, if I were a manufacturing organization, I would worry substantially about the employees I have because I've probably got healthcare information on them. I've probably got certainly tax information, certainly personal information, and I probably have a large body of workers. And there is value in their data. That data can be directly turned into money. And so we saw W-2 attacks on manufacturing last year. It wouldn't surprise me if we saw those in other types of attacks in the future. Professional services. Who in here is a consultant? A few. This is you. Professional services is all the things we do, those kinds of things. And here again, error leading to breach of confidentiality was the most common, but a big part here was business email compromises, right? This is enumerations and fraudulent transactions, and there were 41 fraudulent transactions out of this data set, which is a pretty big portion of it, a little under half. Pretexting, financially staff compromise, right? This is all business email compromise. These are attackers compromising credentials, emailing the CFO, asking for money and getting it. Because, what better way to get money than to ask for it? There also has been an increase in personal information credentials being breached. And some of that can be attributed to the business email compromises, but not all of it, because 54% of breaches involved the theft of internal information or secrets. Right? And you're seeing kind of a pattern here. There's a lot of error, but there's also a lot of theft of internal secrets across the industries. So we got two more left. The first one is government. The next one is going to be retail. And so, again, government has mandatory reporting, so errors are the most common path in public administration. But they have something that the others don't, which is this really big, and actually a big jump up, characteristic of cyber espionage. And the thing that worries me is that the majority of their breaches take years to discover. Like, what would you say if your organization took years to discover most of its breaches? Right? Like, this is a little bit disturbing. And so if you're in public administration, you need to realize that you're being targeted, but you definitely need to improve your detection. And actually next year, I expect to see that we'll see this big uptick. That's going to go down next year, and not for any good reason. And instead, days and maybe even hours is going to go up because of so much ransomware that we're seeing in the public sector happening this year that will go into the next year's corpus. And finally, retail, which is one of the funner ones. Here, they actually have physical breaches compromising confidentiality. as the most common path. And so that's like credit card skimmers, which, isn't surprising that retail has a skimmer issue. But a bigger thing is what we see here, because the reality is that card-present crime, or, crime where it was not a web server that was compromised, is going down. And this is data from the NCFTA, National Cyber Forensics and Training Alliance, and then our internal corpus. And we're seeing this inversion where breaches related to brick and mortar attacks are going down, and online retail attacks are increasing. And that's probably due to a couple reasons. First, we now have chip and signature in the US, and so that actually is having an effect. Next, we've seen some known vulnerabilities in online retail software, credit card processing software, and anyone that didn't patch those is getting breached. And also, like every year, we normally have these big multi-victim point-of-sale breaches where the attackers attack like a point-of-sale vendor, and then they use that access to attack every one of the customers and breach all those point-of-sale systems. And that results in a lot of companies having point-of-sale breaches. And we didn't have any of those last year, though even as we were writing the report, one came in that'll be in next year's report. But in general, we've got this big trend where in retail, you now need to start worrying a lot about your online retail because it is becoming the trend versus in-store point-of-sale breaches. And so, with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and I'll have a little bit of time for questions here at the end, which will be nice. What I want you to take away from this presentation is I want you to think how you balance cost and risk. And so we're going to talk about 3 types of organizations as we do this. The first are the types of organizations that can't afford any of their own security. Like, my dentist doesn't have his own security staff, computer security staff. The local liquor store in my little 3-stoplight town doesn't have, a knock of its own. But there are things that they can do, right? Because the liquor store doesn't own its point-of-sale system, it leases it. And that point-of-sale vendor can then contract and either have their own knock or have an MSSP to provide the security. My dentist, he owns his computers, but he doesn't own the software on them. He leases all that, and it's all managed by another company that can then provide him security as well. And so if you're a small organization, or if you're making recommendations to small organizations, recommend that they get involved in purchasing services where they can access economies of scale when it comes to security. The next is probably where most of us fit, and these are organizations that can afford security. And if you can afford to mitigate something, mitigate the 4 horsemen. That's your 85% solution, right? Do we remember what they are? What was the first one? Anyone? Good. What was the second one? Errors. Third? Social. Great. Fourth? Great. You guys paid attention. I'm so excited by that. It's like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We've eaten. We're kind of coasting down. We're thinking about what we're going to do tonight. I appreciate you guys paying attention. And so what you need to do about that, remember, is patch your externally facing vulnerabilities, like the old and easy ones. Gracefully degrade so the errors don't cause breaches right away. Have a secondary process for verifying money transfers and anything above the level that you're legitimately willing to lose repeatedly. And also all the phishing stuff that we know how to do. And finally, have 2-factor authentication, the other things we do about credentials. And then, and this is where the discussion gets a little bit awkward, because I'm going to tell you that most people in here should probably not invest after that. Instead, you may be better off going and finding the local branch of federal law enforcement. I'll bet there's a decent FBI office here in town, and I bet they know a lot about security. And your best bet for dealing with the advanced threats may be to get to know them early so that they can help you. Because the reality is, to deal with advanced threats, you need to invest a lot. And it doesn't make sense to invest halfway in stopping advanced threats. Because once you stop those obvious attacks, those are the attackers who will try one thing, and if it fails, they'll leave. The advanced threats, if they try one thing and you stop them, they're going to try a second thing. And so the only way you can defeat those guys is if you price them completely out of the market. And that means that you can't stop one path, you have to stop 20 different things they could do, because you can't leave them any path to move forward through the attack graph. And that's expensive and it's hard and you have to commit to that entire thing. And some organizations are willing to do that, right? There are organizations that sign blank checks to their security department because they want that to happen because it's critical to the business. And if that's your organization, by all means do that. But know what you're getting into. Be prepared for that kind of investment. That might be a $100 million a year investment, depending on the size of your organization. And you might not see returns on it, right? Because until you've implemented all those protections, until you can operate your security at that, advanced level, you're still going to lose. It's like if a team tried to move up from the minor leagues to the majors, right? Even if they were really good, and even if they had all the support in the world, it's going to take them a while before they start winning games. And the same thing applies to your organization. But if you want to be that good organization, if you want to defeat those advanced threats, by all means, commit and do it. And no matter what kind of organization you are, whether you're a large organization or a small one, the most important thing is that you just do something, because every little bit helps you not be the easiest target. And so with that, I'll put up the cool slide that you can take a picture of again. All those lists about things that you could do and the path stuff and such is on here. And I have like 5 minutes for questions. That's very good of me. Normally I just run my entire time out. So if you have any questions, this is your opportunity to ask. Let's see. Yeah.
Do you see an uptake in the use of deepfake technology and trying to persuade users to give over their credentials or make financial transfers?
So the question was, have we seen an uptick in deepfake technology? And while I have seen news articles that claim that such a thing happened, I have not seen any evidence at all that it has happened at all, because it was claimed that it happened, but there was no clear evidence to prove that claim. Any other questions? I saw one over here, yeah.
Can you give a little bit of insight into that 14-step attack?
Oh, I'll be honest, I don't remember it from the others. And because we operate so much on aggregate data that the only things that even stick with us are the funny, interesting ones, or the ones that are used to make a point about the aggregate data.
It's such an outlier.
Yeah, but my guess is it's just, one, I probably wasn't the one that put it into the data set, and so I may never have even seen it individually. But those kinds of things happen. There are attacks where you have it, and a lot of times, in fact, it's hard to see on this chart, but in the advanced attacks, you saw a lot where there was just an unknown action that started. And what we really see a lot of in advanced attacks is that once you get past a certain point, there is no record of what happened before it. And so you only pick up the attack here, and stuff happened before it. But if you don't catch it before it's gotten to its 5th or its 6th or its 7th step, you lose the records about how they got in. Which also means it's hard to determine whether you got them out. And so this is another reason to be very careful about about losing visibility on advanced attacks if you're going to be planning on mitigating those types of attacks. Any other questions? Back to the room. Yeah. Supply chain, it would depend how the attack happened. When we talk about partners, it means that your partner was evil. It doesn't mean that the attack came through the partner. That said, a lot of times we code secondary victims. And so if, the attack was on a certain organization, but was then used to compromise another organization, we try to code those. But we see a lot where 2 organizations are involved. An example from last week. And by the way, if you're ever interested, I try to stream Tuesdays and Thursdays of us coding the public data set, VCDB, into, I look up a news article and then you can watch me on Twitch, turn that into structured data. And then I put them on YouTube so people can go back and look, because I want other people to be able to do this so that other organizations can analyze their own data. But one of the ones we saw last week was where it was a company had one of their, not one of their customers, one of their suppliers, or someone that provided a service for them, had access to the company's data and was breached, and that therefore, but it gets counted against whoever the biggest company in the chain is, right? Because it doesn't make a good news article if you just talk about, some minor service that no one knows about. And so it was called the bigger company. We also saw one where two companies were working together, and then their service kind of got breached. And then there was, in fact, one, Facebook one where, like, Facebook didn't even get breached, but someone had been scraping email or phone numbers off of Facebook, stored them in like a MongoDB database, and put it on the internet. And someone looked it up on, Shodan and found it. And, no one says, hey, this random internet server, we don't even know who runs this, website or this server got breached. They all say Facebook got breached. And so a lot of times it's very ambiguous who really should be counted responsible for the breach. Now, if you're talking about supply chain in terms of like kind of the advanced threat, like compromised the, I guess the quintessential one would be like the one where the defense one, where they compromised the third level down subcontractor. They got the CEO's son, who also used the laptop, to download some malware. And that was used to compromise the data of the contractor, who was used to compromise the data of the DoD, and these several steps. And that happened like several years ago, but the reality is that's not the easy path for the attackers, right? They want the easy path, and so if they have to do that in advance, a few of the advanced attackers will do that, but the majority of them are just going to email the main target and go, hey, would you download this and run it? And someone's going to do it.